Thank you very much, Tomasz. It's a great pleasure to be here, even if only online, and see this significant interest in the topic. I was asked, or I volunteered, more precisely put, to give an introduction to this series, and of course it means that I'm going to have a broad spectrum view, and I'm going to share with you the things how I see them, and of course it has nothing to do with any official view, understandably. I see them through a person who has lived in the Soviet Union, lived in post-Soviet space, who speaks the language, who wrote his first article on the Andropov era in 1984, and ever since I am following with great interest the developments over there, whether they were reassuring or saddening, as the current developments are certainly saddening developments. It's a broad spectrum view, and my main intention is to get to the point how we got to this war. And I see it overwhelmingly through the Russian eyes, and I go back to the beginning and start, as nearly every presentation in the last 30 years started, with the end of the Cold War and what it meant. And so the early beginning is that when we speak about a war, we have to also think about something that we learned in the 20th century. And what we learned in the 20th century is that if you have a military conflict and you win, you have to help the recovery of the country which is vanquished. And that's, of course, obviously the case of Germany, which was not helped in its recovery after World War I, whereas it was helped in its recovery after World War II. Now the question is, of course, whether we tried to help Russia and whether we tried to help Russia accommodate in the international system. And of course, the answer is that we did try, but it made fairly little difference because the structures that would have absorbed this support beyond the general sympathy towards the Russian people was not taken, and the advantages that we tried to share and the concrete financial benefits, actually $80 billion that was allocated in the first years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, basically disappeared in offshores and real estates in different parts of the world and in an oligarchic class. Now, of course, what do you do if you intend to help and you are not recognized for it, and the help is actually denied or rejected? And this was the most visible change in the end of the Cold War, that we moved away from a bipolar international structure, and the structure of international system changed from a bipolar one to a non-bipolar one. And I don't want to tell whether it was a unipolar international system, because of course it's a significant simplification. Nevertheless, I quote George Herbert Bush this time, who said in his last State of the Union message, "We were the leader of the West and we have become the leader of the world." So there was this image that the international system changed. But there was a far less visible but similarly important change, namely the sources of power changed with the end of the bipolar era. And they have become more diverse, and military power ceased to be the ultimate source of power and has become only a component of the power spectrum. This is important for the reason that the Russian Federation, which increasingly often identifies itself with the Soviet Union, which I think is regrettable, has lost the most important source of power where it was a preeminent power. And other sources of power actually gave no prominence to the Russian Federation. And as a consequence, the Russian Federation, as the largest successor state of the Soviet Union, faced a dual adaptation challenge, adapting to the fact that it is no longer a pole of a bipolar international system, and adapting to the fact that the main sources of power that Russia possessed lost their importance, or at least their importance has been reduced. And of course, one has to understand that when a bipolar system ends, and that was basically a fundamental change of the international system, then it is not only the losers who have to adapt, but also the winners, because that's a very important change also for the United States. And I actually don't think that the United States adapted particularly well to this situation. It started to feel not having limits on its own power. And of course, Russia embarked upon an experiment with adaptation, which was a combination of democratization and westernization at the same time. Russia was ready to recognize to be a junior partner or a younger brother. Still, I think, and this is a regular victimization issue in the Russian Federation, Russia felt that it was recognized. It was not recognized for offering a cooperative approach to international relations and recognizing that it was a junior partner and a younger brother. As a consequence, we ended up in a failure because democracy was combined with the disappearance of social stability, huge income differences, unexpected hike of unemployment, oligarchic structures, governance issues, and also by a weak national pride. So the Russian people did not have the national pride that the Soviet people, may I say, had at least until Mikhail Gorbachev, maybe, irrespective of the fact that the regimes were awkward, totally oppressive, or totally stalemated, or both. As a consequence, there was disenchantment and disillusionment, and there was no positive association with the democratic system and market economy. As a consequence, I think Russia became, by the end of the 20th century, a low-hanging fruit. A low-hanging fruit which was available to anybody who came in with the offer of bringing order and prosperity. And as a consequence, you may remember Vladimir Putin was not a particularly popular or well-known or well-recognized politician, but of course, with the help of a few terrorist attacks that led to the Second Chechnya War, he started to increase his popularity and started to deliver on his promise of order and eventually prosperity. And of course, very often in history, you have to be lucky. And Vladimir Putin was lucky in the sense that the most important commodity that Russia is relying upon or was relying upon in its export, oil, started to increase its value, and a 12 years long near continuous economic growth hit Russia. During this period between the year 2000 and 2012, Russia's GDP increased 2.5 times, which is a very significant increase. As a consequence, Russian people started to live better, that they certainly attributed it to their leader. Whether it was attributable to him or not is a separate matter. Certainly he fixed a number of glitches that characterized the previous regime, an oligarchic and ineffective regime of Boris Yeltsin, in particular in the second term of Boris Yeltsin as president of the Russian Federation. So Russia became more self-assured and became more ambitious. And when we are going to speak about the Putin era that I assume will end not in 2036, that was the original deadline that Vladimir Vladimirovich set for himself, but significantly earlier, we are not going to be in the position to speak about one era. The Putin era is important to understand, is evolving, it's changing, it is leaving some of its characteristic features that characterized it in the first few years, when we all believed that the Russian president, although has a certain baggage as far as his background, but still he's in the end full of goodwill and he wants to cooperate with us and so on and so forth. The Russian president for the first time said in April 2015 that the Russian Federation would like to be a pole of a multipolar international order. And these two things were connected in the mind of Vladimir Putin. If there is a multipolar international order, the Russian Federation is an indispensable pole of it. What Vladimir Putin did not understand or did not want to understand was that, of course, the Russian Federation is a lopsided power. The Russian Federation has enormous strength, has a large territory, has a fairly well-educated population, has natural resources, has a large armed force, has intelligence services which are, until recently, were working reasonably well. Don't forget about Litvinenko and Skripal. But in the end, it was there. It has a very well functioning diplomacy, and so on and so forth. So the Russian Federation has strength. At the same time, the Russian Federation has significant weaknesses. It is not producing a single laptop computer until now. It was producing smartphones between 2015 and 2018 and stopped producing because it was not compatible. Not to mention this lovely little thing that the Russian friends of mine don't want to remember, that the smartphones were assembled in China. So Russia has a very weak consumer economy. And also, Russia is not a role model. When I'm ironical, I usually ask this question, who wants to live like a Russian? And I don't mean like a Russian oligarch in one of the high rises in Moscow or sometime out in the northwest of Moscow near Novo-Ogaryovo, where the president built his new seat outside of Moscow. No. Who wants to live like an average Russian? Maybe an average Tajik. As a consequence, Russia is not a role model. It is not the US way of life as we got it after World War II, or the Western way of life that it turned into being. And of course, ever since 2005, 2007, 2008, we started to have enormous difficulties with the Russian Federation. Some attributed to one moment, some to the other. Some start with the Munich speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, where Vladimir Putin in person listed all those things that he did not like in the West. Or we can start it with 2008 with the invasion of Georgia on August 7. Of course, you can say that it was partly due to Mikhail Saakashvili's somewhat absurd rhetoric. Still, the common sense view is that it was unlikely that this less than 5 million people attacked and challenged one of the largest military powers of the world. But of course, sometime, funnily enough, it still happened, because if you read the so-called Tagliavini report, you will immediately notice that it says that the military conflict started with the massive shelling of Tsinvali in the night of the 7th of August 2008. A year later, Sergei Karaganov, one of the most seasoned Russian analysts, wrote an article under the title "The Magic Numbers of 2009", and he said, Russia may turn from a revisionist state, changing the disadvantageous rules of the game imposed upon it in the 1990s, into a revanchist state. And indeed, this happened. Russia has become a revanchist power under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, whose own personal mentality is very much a mentality which is centered around the idea that the Soviet Union in the end was a good experiment, and it is bad that it ended. As you also know, He also said in 2005 that it was the biggest geostrategic tragedy of the 20th century that the Soviet Union got dissolved. 2 weeks later, Mikhail Saakashvili found a microphone somewhere in Tbilisi and said the best thing that happened in the 20th century was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. 3 years later, the two countries went to war, but we were still in the mood to say, no, in the end, it's Saakashvili, he was provoking, it's not a new political era, it is something in between. And of course, NATO and the West got divided. Some countries were of the view that we can go back to business as usual, and the Taliavini report was definitely helping this when it blamed the immediate start of the hostilities on Georgia. And we went back to business as usual, although some of our friends in Washington, London, and Warsaw were of the view that we should start a new era with the Russian Federation. In 2013, the Russian economy started to slow. And I am just saying one sentence because Viktor Seif will speak about it far more competently than I ever could. But it was very interesting because the Russian victimization idea always links Russia's economic decline with the economic sanctions. This is to a large extent unfounded. In 2013, the sanctions were not there, Crimea was not yet annexed, and so on and so forth. Actually, the fall of the oil price and the following fall of gas prices had a much bigger impact on the Russian economy than sanctions could do until fairly recently. And of course, this is also an issue that I'm sure Viktor will speak about in the next week. The average growth of Russia, which was so significant for 12 consecutive years, except for the financial crisis, basically 1 year when they had a little bit of a hiccup, was slowing down. The Russian economy since 2013, on the average, increased 1%. Of course, on the average, you also calculate those 2 years when the Russian economy was significantly contracting. And that happened in 2015 by 3.7% minus, and in 2020, understandably, by a 4% minus. That, of course, was compensated in 2021 with a 4.1% growth of the Russian economy. The Russian economy, as a consequence, is not growing too much. Less people feel to belong to the middle class. There was a moment that was the maximum when 37% of the Russian people allegedly were of the view that they belong to the middle class. Now it's in the low 20s. So some people do feel that they are falling off from the former middle class status. They can't afford a holiday in Antalya because Antalya is cheaper than Crimea. Funny. They can't send their children to language schools abroad, and so on and so forth. So there are issues which indicate that the Russian economy is not flying so high as it used to. The sanctions actually contributed to the Russian economic malaise approximately 1.2% minus per year. And that, of course, results in a situation that the gap between Russia and, of course, some countries of the Asia Pacific, as well as many countries of the West, is widening, which is not a good feel. So Russia may feel that it is losing out to its competitors and its rivals. Now, of course, more losses will have to be accepted by the Russian Federation, and I'm sure that we will be listening with great interest to Viktor next week. Still, Russia is a small economy. Russia in the global economy is small. According to the CIA World Factbook, the best thing that the CIA does for the world. Okay, that was a bad joke. Or actually, not so bad. So it's 1.94% nominally and 2.94% in purchasing power parity terms. According to the World Bank, it's 1.56% of the world economy. So Russia is a relatively small economy. At the same time, the Russian economy is not that small, because it's at the same time 54.9% of the economy of the 12 former republics. As a consequence, in the post-Soviet space, the Russian economy is a decisive factor, and it's a hub. There is a hub and spoke system. Everybody links up with Moscow, even the countries which are politically not aligning their position with the Russian Federation, be it Georgia or be it Ukraine. As you know, Georgia did not join the sanctions regime that was introduced, and lots of Russian money is being funneled via Georgian bank accounts nowadays, just to give you an idea where to look. Because the Georgians have more than 10% of their external trade. During Mikhail Saakashvili, the lowest point was 5.7% import of Georgia from Russia and 1.5% export of Georgia to Russia. That was the moment when you went to a Georgian restaurant in Moscow and you had to drink Moldovan wine, which is totally unbearable for any normal person who likes going to a Georgian restaurant, and there are quite some good ones in Moscow. Okay, so the Russian economy is small and big at the same time. And of course, Russia wanted to, in a soft way, re-establish the post-Soviet space, which overwhelmingly had authoritarian, in some cases outright dictatorial regimes. What were the demands of the Russian Federation? I think the first one was no departure from the former Soviet space. You can be either neutral. Moldova is a neutral state. Turkmenistan is a positively neutral state. And formally, the Belarusians could say that they are neutral, but it's a bad joke. Belarus is increasingly reminding us of the joke about Afghanistan after 1979, which asked the question, which was the world's least imperialist country? And the answer was Afghanistan, because it doesn't even interfere in its own domestic affairs. And Belarus, I think, is second to that. And of course, as of 2008, the demand was that there was no NATO membership or no NATO membership aspiration. But Russia moved the target of the red line. In 2013, Ukraine was a neutral country during the reign of Mr. Yanukovych, who is now sitting in Belarus waiting for the return to his beloved country. I don't think that he will arrive. And as of 2013, they changed the table, and the demand was no flirt with the West and no joining the West. And of course, these were the red lines, and these are still the red lines for the Russian Federation. And many countries which have authoritarian leaders who would enjoy staying in power until the end of life are happily playing along, irrespective of the fact whether their people are happily playing along. And of course, Ukraine and Belarus are two countries which have special importance for the Russian Federation, for three reasons. They are Eastern Slavs, they are Orthodox, majority or not, and they are forming a buffer zone. And let me make a little excursion here on buffer zones. First of all, buffer zones don't matter too much when you have long-range missiles. It is not 1941 when the Soviet Union would have needed a larger buffer zone. The second issue is that the buffer zone idea of the Russian Federation, which is very much a demand of the Russian Federation currently, is based on the fact that Russia has not yet reflected upon the beginning of World War II. A thorough Russian military historian reading should say that when World War II started, the Russian general staff was largely decapitated. They had 5 years long debate whether it's cavalry or battle tanks and armored combat vehicles, which matter, and firepower, which matter in a war. And last but not least, the Russian Federation did not trust its own intelligence, including Dr. Zorge, who was a Soviet spy in Tokyo, who was unfortunately arrested as an American spy and executed in 1944, but that's okay. He was actually a German communist originally. So the buffer zone idea was saying that you need this buffer because in the Soviet Union would not have faced this difficulty so much. But the Soviet Union faced this difficulty because it was it was basically a suicidal policy that the Russians did to their military, the Soviet Union did to its military, and then of course we have to understand why it did not work. Now of course the question is whether this quest can be accepted. And of course Vladimir Putin, who has this sort of very pro-Soviet history mentality, is saying a few things about it, or actually he's writing. And I would recommend everybody to read the July 2 article of July 12 article of Vladimir Putin of last year, where he speaks about the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. And I just quote one short paragraph. Russians, Ukrainians and Belarusians are all descendants of ancient Rus, which was the largest state in Europe. Slavic and other tribes across the vast territory were bound together by one language, which we now refer to as Old Russian, economic ties, the rule of the princes of the Rurik dynasty, and after the baptism of Rus, the Orthodox faith. So you have to understand that for Russia, Belarus and Ukraine are forming an indispensable core that must not be broken up. And of course, my generation and people who are significantly older to me are all remembering this kind of togetherness, this jointness, and they feel that it's unnatural that it came to an end. And of course, the Russian Federation is now insisting on getting security guarantees. It already put forward a recommendation on this in the same vein, the so-called Medvedev initiative that ended up in the European Security Treaty draft in 2009. And of course, we must not forget that Russia's leaders are quite often coming from the intelligence or counterintelligence services. These guys are particularly good in inventing things from which you cannot come out well. So either you lose or you win, you cannot come out well. And this is Russia's second attempt with this. The Russian demand for security guarantees could end up in two different ways. One, the West rejects Russia. If the West rejects Russia, Russia is free to act. If the West accepts what Russia offers or Russia requests, not to mention demands, then Russia again wins because it's a major diplomatic victory. So that's why the West was so extremely careful how to react to the Russian demand for security guarantees. And it was handed over to the United States in two documents on the 15th of December 2021, and then 2 days later it appeared in Russian and English on the Russian Foreign Ministry's website. And of course, these security guarantees have interesting demands. The first one is that was in the treaty draft to be concluded with the United States, that the United States had to commit itself, or should have committed itself, that the United States of America shall undertake to prevent further eastward expansion of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and deny access to deny accession to the alliance to the states of the former Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And of course, this was something that was very difficult to imagine to be accepted. It is also important to mention that in the agreement draft to be concluded with NATO, Russia said the following: the Russian Federation and all the parties that were member states of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization as of the 27th of May 1997, respectively, shall not deploy military forces and weaponry on the territory of any other states in Europe, in addition to the forces stationed on that territory as of the 27th of May 1997. So Russia wanted to reverse history. It wanted to achieve that Ukraine and other post-Soviet states would never be able to join NATO, and it wanted to achieve that those countries that joined since 1999 would not be allowed to host foreign military forces of old member states. So the Americans cannot deploy to Poland, the Canadians cannot go to, I don't know, Estonia, the Lithuanians can't host the Germans, but for instance, the Estonians can contribute to the defense of Romania or Bulgaria, which is of course indicating where the most important Russian sore point was, and it was the Americans should be further away. And this is not new. This goes back to Mr. Litvinov 1935, when he first conceived the idea that Europe without the United States is a better Europe. Wonderful. So there was not much of a problem with this to go back to something. Funny, and most people will not remember, and the Russians surely not remember, there is only one country in East Central Europe that could still host American troops, irrespective whether this was acceptable. And that's Hungary. Because in Hungary, in Tasar, there were American troops in 1997. And when I come to this conclusion, I also laugh on the inside, because Hungary is the country that is very reticent to host American troops, and it believes, as we remember Zsolt Lányi from the Smallholders Party, who once said that one Hungarian soldier is better than 5,000 American GIs. Unfortunately, Mr. Lányi is no longer with us, so he can't repeat this wonderful and far-fetched idea. So what does Russia demand? Russia demanded in December to neutralize and demilitarize the Ukraine. In February, the demand in the speech of Vladimir Putin, and he had two major speeches, one on the 21st, one on the 24th, both recorded on the same occasion on the 21st, funny, were two demands: Denazification, if you like the German word, Entnazifizierung, and demilitarization. And of course, it's very innovative to demand Entnazifizierung from a country where the president is half Jewish. That's just to give you an idea about some of the absurdities. Now, getting closer to the war, the assumption of Putin launching the war, noticing that he was facing a so-called runaround. The Western countries were just making Sergei Lavrov and some others running around without getting anywhere, without getting firm commitments. And the Russians insisted on a written legal commitments, because they said they are always playing us, they are ignoring us. And of course, that commitment it could not get, because NATO was not willing to give up on open door policy. And we are not going to decide the fate of other countries when, according to the OSCE documents of 1996 and 2010, it is everybody's own business to decide whether it wants to belong to an alliance or not. And of course, it's a separate matter that we can decide whether to take or not. Russia, at the same time, behind closed doors, got commitments from Western political leaders. Allegedly, the French said to them, or personally Emmanuel Macron, that France is not going to contribute to NATO enlargement towards Ukraine in the next decade. Whereas Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, said Ukraine's NATO accession is not on the table. But it was not good enough. Not to mention the war preparation was already going on. When Vladimir Putin had his 21st of February speech, which is available on the Kremlin website also in English, I said, okay, they want to take Donetsk and Luhansk, DNR and LNR, declare its independence, and then eventually have a referendum in the two territories and they will join the Russian Federation. No, on the 22nd, it turned out that the Russian Federation wants to recognize Donetsk and Luhansk as former oblasts, their former territory, which was significantly larger than the territory held by the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. And in the war, they haven't yet fully achieved this, because although Mariupol fell under Russian control on Tuesday evening, but on Wednesday morning, again, the Russians called on the population to leave, which is indicative that fighting is still going on. But by now, as of today, the Donetsk Republic has achieved full control, or more or less full control, over the Oblast of Donetsk, whereas Luhansk achieved by this morning 73% of the control of the former Luhansk area in the Russian Federation. This is what the Russian television said to me this morning and showed it also on the toolbar if I wanted to forget it. So, of course, we don't know what the war entails as of now. Yesterday afternoon, Volodymyr Zelensky spoke about 6,000 casualties on the Russian side, dead and wounded together. By this morning, the Russians fought back with the argument that they lost 498 persons. This is, of course, immediately. So for a long time, we are not going to know the losses. Okay, now, of course, what war? The president's assumption, the Russian president's assumption was that this would be an easy walk in the woods. We are going there, they are waiting for us with flowers, they are inviting us for a good borscht soup in the evening, and that will be it. And after 7 days, the Russian Federation is controlling a very small part of Ukraine. It has not finished the offensive to surround Kiev. It is not controlling Kharkiv, in spite of the fact that they use this, in Hungarian terms, called vacuum bomb, which caused 21 immediate dead and a good number of wounded. So that was the assumption, and that's why the Russian Federation sent young soldiers, 19 and 20-year-old kids, to the war, who were actually used as cannon fodder. So many people deceased, many people are wounded, and many people will have irrecoverable difficulties in their life. But there was a slow advancement, and we are standing there more than 7 days after the war started, and the Russian Federation has not yet prevailed, because it was on the basis of wrong assumptions, and the wrong assumption came from the political leadership, not from the military. But of course, Russia is a very centralized power structure, and if you don't want to lose out, you'd better behave. It's imperfect logistics, fuel supply is insufficient, the gradually increasing firepower is just coming late. You know, in any normal war, you would have taken out the TV tower. When did the Russians do it? Yesterday afternoon, after 6.5 days, which is totally absurd. Apparently, they were not preparing under the assumption that the Ukrainians are going to take a fierce fight against them. And of course, the wrong conception. Now, of course, and I will soon finish, there is an adaptation. It's increased intensity. Russia is using more those methods which are objectionable under humanitarian international law. And of course, as Russia also has a domestic aspect to it, Russia is getting more oppressive. Tomorrow, the Russian Federation will most probably introduce martial law in the country, which will make it possible to punish people who misrepresent facts about this war up to 15 years of imprisonment. Fortunately, some of the liberal journalists are not going to face this, because Echo Moskwy was stopped today, and Novaya Gazeta, whose chief editor got the Nobel Peace Prize just last autumn, was also stopped today. So they are not going to be held responsible because they are not publishing. But there will be people and there will be showcased situations. Now, the opposition to the Russian leadership, which will be more oppressive, will focus on three areas: the media, the intelligentsia, the liberals, the people, the artists, the scientists, and the medical doctors, who all had these kind of public appeals. And the last one is that there were 5 MPs who on Monday asked in the Russian Duma, what about a real war when Russia promised them a peace operation? Of course, that was the day when I could not watch Russia 24, because of course the signal went out, so it was not available. Now, of course, the problem is that the Russian demands as of now are the following, and there are 4.5 demands. Vladimir Putin demands the recognition of the independent statehood of the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, demands the recognition of the fact that Crimea is a part of the Russian Federation. It wants to neutralize Ukraine and wants to demilitarize Ukraine. These are the 4 things that Vladimir Putin actually said today, whereas Sergei Lavrov added a 5th one, but Sergei Lavrov's role may be less prominent in the Russian system. He said foreigners should leave Ukraine. Of course, probably he means American, British and Canadian military advisors more than Chinese investors. Chinese investors are not willing to leave. The Kharkiv medical school students of India are not probably belonging to this category. So we are going to see a situation, and apparently I think the solution of this conflict is not going to come in the battlefield. It will come from somewhere else. And of course, we are going to face a dangerous hedging phase now, when the Russians will be hedging because they want to achieve victory, because the Russian leadership knows that, as many countries in the world, it can lose a war not in the battlefield but actually at home, although it's not a democracy and the leadership is tightly controlled by a few people. And of course, the West is hedging because the West is living under the assumption that in the end the Russians lost this war, because the Russians are 500 kilometers away from Lutsk and Lviv and Munkachevo. As a consequence, they have no chance. They are happy to have occupied Kherson, which is important to them because the Kherson Canal is taking water from Ukraine to the Crimea. And of course, we end up in a situation where there is very limited chance to see the Russian Federation not as a Germany of 1919, but a Germany of 1945, a country which is going to recover and will find its place in the international system. And of course, last but not least, there are broader systemic repercussions of this issue. And those broader repercussions entail that the Russian-Chinese coalition is weakening, although it is not dissolving. The Chinese are trying to achieve some kind of reconciliation between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, and China, of course, has significant power. And of course, the West is getting more united. This is one thing that Vladimir Putin never wanted to achieve, because Vladimir Putin was of the view, if the power distribution in the international system is asymmetrical, then there are 2 things that Russia should do. One, to avoid the unity of the adversary. So the lovely Hungaries, Bulgarias, Cypruses, Greece, occasionally Italy, Austria are lovely. They are not contributing to the unity of the West. They are weakening the West. The Germans are okay because at least they are sort of peaceniks over there. And now you see Germany spending 100 billion euro more on its military, although the military would not be able to absorb it. Don't worry about it. it will take a long time until the money can be used, and so on and so forth. So the Russians pushed the West together. There is more unity in the West than they wanted. The other thing that the Russians always wanted is to have allies and allegiances and supporters, countries which would align their policy with the West and will contribute to Russia's increasing power. And there, of course, China was the pearl of the pearl. And that pearl is, of course, abstaining in the UN Security Council last week and was abstaining yesterday together with 34 other countries in the UN General Assembly at the emergency special session. So Russia basically went to a war under a wrong assumption, and it's extremely difficult to foresee how Russia is going to come out of it, irrespective of the American intelligence predictions, which all focus on one thing, and they are of the view that the Russians in the end will prevail in the battlefield. But I am not so sure that we are going to see this, and I stop here. I spoke not much longer than I promised, and I hope that there will be questions. I already saw one in the chat group, but it was going so quickly that I could not read it. So thanks so much for your kind attention, and look forward to an interesting exchange of views and disagreements and questions. Thanks a lot.